I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello, and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host. When we talk about justice reform, we often talk about sentencing or parole or recidivism, but what about what happens inside prison, the slow, invisible work of becoming someone new? My guest today, Dr. Daphne Bryden, is an assistant professor of social work at the University of Cincinnati, whose career bridges clinical practice and justice reform. With over 20 years of experience as a therapist, evaluator, and community partner, she studies trauma, transformation, and reentry among people who are sentenced to life as children. In her work, Dr. Bryden traces the continuum of transformation from learning how to survive in a violent environment to reclaiming one's humanity to learning how to love again after decades behind bars. Dr. Bryden, thank you so much for coming on the show. I am so excited to have this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
So, you have worked across hospitals, across schools, across prisons, and I'm wondering, when did you realize that your path would bring you to the intersection of trauma and what we think about as the justice system?
That is such a great question to start off because I think that discovery was kind of slow for me and really was born out of all of those experiences clinically. I think the first time that I thought about it was when I was working in the emergency department. And at the same time, I was also working on this research project with youth who were incarcerated, and we were doing these mental health evaluations and just starting to see the role that systems play in traumatizing, re-traumatizing individuals. And I think that that's where that really came from. And I started to become unsettled maybe with the idea of being just a clinician at that point and just working on the front lines, and wanted to really understand more about the intersection of kind of this system's impact on individuals and how maybe to do that better.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that because you are this clinician with so many fabulous years sort of working in the field, but you're also an academic and a researcher. And so I'm wondering how that frames the way you listen to stories and you listen to people's experiences.
I had one of the mentors on my dissertation committee met me for coffee one time as I was kind of early on in these interviews, and was remarking on how surprised in a way she was with the interviews that I was conducting, the conversations I was having with participants.
And I don't mean to interrupt you, but
No,
let's actually clarify because
yeah,
I don't know that we spelled it out so clearly. When we're
yeah,
talking about interviews, we're talking about interviews with folks who were sentenced to life essentially as juveniles, right? So
right,
that's who you're
right,
talking to when you're talking
right.
about the folks you're interviewing. You're talking about people who had been condemned to die in prison and got a chance to get out.
Exactly, exactly. So I think, well, maybe, so then I will back up. So my dissertation was with folks who were sentenced to life without parole, sentenced to die in prison as kids in the state of Michigan. And my research was taking place right about the time that the Supreme Court had ruled these sentences unconstitutional, at least the mandatory sentences, and then we're granting folks an opportunity for resentence and release. So I was working with folks who had just been released in Michigan and conducting these long qualitative interviews and asking all kinds of nosy questions about their life and their experience. And the conversations were long and they were interesting and they were full of information that I had never been exposed to outside of reading something in a book, and very rich. And so that was kind of a conversation that I was having with my mentor around feeling surprised. And even though I'm this clinician and I've had really intimate conversations with folks, it felt like something a little bit different. And in particular, because my lived experience was so different than the folks I was talking to. And so, anyway, we were kind of talking about that, and I think the approach that I take and that I took with these conversations was really not one as a, I don't know, it seems funny, not one as a clinician, but kind of taking that recognition that what we were doing together, this conversation that we were having together, was something that we were kind of co-creating a narrative and a conversation that was different than what we could do alone. And that, I think, is part of like the clinician that I will always take into the research, is that whenever I'm encountering somebody as a participant, as a collaborator, as whatever, we are doing something together. We're co-creating something together that is not that is beyond what we could do by ourselves. And it's important.
Mm, yeah, that is important, right? Because when a person is released from prison, there's all these systems in place, and it's impossible to navigate them alone, and shape a new narrative alone. So your work is so interesting and important because it captures that. And I know that in your research, um, in talking with these folks who have been incarcerated for a really long time, you once had someone say to you, "You don't have to be prison."
Mm,
And that
mm.
just kind of blew me away. Like, what did that mean to you when someone said that?
The first conversations that I had in 2017 with folks who had been released really highlighted this idea of transformation. And I think that that's part of where it comes from. There was a participant I was talking to who shared this story that their mom had shared with them. So I had a participant who shared a story about a dream that his mother had. And this is maybe the thing that kind of gets stuck in my head about transformation and how this kind of comes to be. So he shared, incarceration helped me make sense out of a lot of things. And my mother had the gift of dreams. She had this dream that she was in the kitchen washing dishes and she was looking out of the window, and I was in a playpen in the backyard. And the gate was left open to the yard, and she saw a dragon, a big red dragon, slither down the alleyway and come into the backyard and swallow me whole. And when it raised up, she said the belly was like glass and she could see me, but there were bubbling acids in the stomach. And she said I was hovering just above the acids and I was smiling. She likened it to my incarceration, that I'd been swallowed by the belly of the beast, but the adverse effect that it should have had on me, the corruption, the corrosion that should have occurred in that belly, was not happening. Instead, I had started to thrive. I started to find me because of, well, the environment sort of dictated it. You're going to go two directions. And so, yeah, I always think that's amazing that, I mean, it spit me out. And so that was one of the first conversations that I had with somebody who was released. And so as I continued through conversations, this representation of prison as being this horrible space, really built for uh, crushing someone, for killing someone, for, um, you know, say rehabilitation, but the way that people experience it is not often in that way. And yet they can make a choice. They often do make a choice. There's this point in which they can decide it, I don't have to do it this way.
Yeah, no, that is a really difficult decision because prison is a really difficult place. And I'm wondering, as you sort of have talked to these people, the people who were released after serving all this time, and who, you're sort of visiting with as they're beginning this new journey back to freedom and society. What did you find, or what have you identified as some of the coping mechanisms that have helped people survive and grow? What served them in prison? And is it still serving them now? What did you learn?
Well, I mean, being able to go back and talk through somebody's life, I think the coping strategies that people use changed over time. And I think that that is one of you know, the gifts of coping is that you can adjust and change. And so I think people talked about initially when they came in, really doing whatever it was that they could to survive. And so even if how they showed up was a gnarlier version of how they felt inside or who they really believed that they were, they felt like they needed to show up in that way just to be able to make it through in that early time. And then as people talked about the time that they spent, it was, developing relationships as much as they could as they moved around prisons a lot. It was reading. It was, people talked about conversations that they had if they were in solitary with other people, just kind of like not face to face, but kind of conversations in that space. For many, it was education, learning how to read. It was keeping up with folks on the outside. It was writing, art. Sometimes there was mental health treatment, but most of the time it was really how they spent their time and making choices about that. And for this group in particular, there was, many places did not provide an opportunity for them to be a part of, programming. The idea was that, if they were never going to be released, then what's the point of spending resources to do that? And so, whenever people could, that was another thing. If they happened to be in a facility where they were permitted to take on programs or get involved in things, then they would certainly do that as well.
Yeah, I don't know that people realize just how punitive life sentences are because so many of the people who are serving life, as you just said, are excluded from programs. And so they are really left to deal with the monotony of the day to day of prison and being locked away without access to some of the more creative outlets that can make a person whole and sort of find their dignity in all of that. And yet you spoke to so many people who made choices to find ways to be more human, if you will, to find personality and dignity and hope within the confines of a prison. Um, and that's really powerful stuff. Now, I know that you have identified sort of a transformation age. Can you say a little bit about that?
The way that the research kind of unfolded was really this idea that perhaps how people cope when they were younger has an impact on how long it takes them to get to this transformation point. In this research, really looking at kind of those early coping, it's almost like style rather than strategies, but if someone kind of the typologies that emerged out of the research were, avoidance or things that or isolation, kind of going internal was one way that people described how they dealt with the adversity of their childhood. Um, Another group talked about kind of those more of an externalizing is what we would say. So things like delinquent behavior, boosting cars, stealing, kind of the typical things that we would see people, some arguing, fighting, etc. And then there was this third group where they described it was almost like externalizing it on steroids in a way. It was really aggressive. So one of the participants talked about it as like the monster truck approach. It was kind of like, you will not be able to do anything to me. I'm going to go through you if I don't like it. Lots of fighting, lots of aggression, lots of violence. Um, and so those were kind of the three types of coping that people identified. And so when I broke out kind of the life stories and people's kind of narrations around their transformation, what I found was for those who had more of that internal kind of isolation, avoidance type coping early on, they reach that transformation point much earlier in their young adulthood. So in early 20s, let's say. For folks who were more externalizing, they were more mid to late 20s. And for folks who were really in that kind of aggressive fighting space, they reached transformation much more into their 30s.
Mm,
And so it, trying to figure out now how to, think about that and measure that, but really recognizing that perhaps when we think about supporting people who are in prison, considering how we meet them where they are in terms of their coping and help build skills and develop capacity for being able to move towards that transformation point in a more personalized and predictable way, perhaps, I guess. That might be my, big eyes, big heart idea in the future. But I think that like recognizing, right, that transformation comes, but at a whole, there are lots of things that go into it. I think the other thing that came out of that is less about an age and more about the types of catalysts or the types of things that prompted someone's transformation. And so
mm,
this was the other piece as we're talking about, their development over young adulthood into middle adulthood. People talked about the importance of relationships, and that some talked about relationships being kind of the catalyst for that transformation. Some people talked about critical events. So this was a death of a parent. That was a huge one. And
mm,
particularly the death of a mom or a grandmother, a primary caregiver, let's say, or, a critical health event, a diagnosis, heart attack, those kinds of things. People talked about programming, the combination of programming and relationships, and then also the role of solitary confinement in terms of their transformation. And that one, I had to go back to folks and talk about that one because that one was a complicated one. And so there were lots of different reasons why people also kind of made that decision to do things differently, and to be able to say, I don't have to be prison, and if I'm not going to be prison, then what am I going to be? And then
mm,
kind of continue on from there. Even though for most people, this transformation point happened well before any of the Supreme Court decisions, well before there was any hint or promise of the possibility for resentencing and or release. And so I find that really remarkable in so many ways.
yeah, because these are people who didn't have to transform because it wasn't like they were currying favor. They weren't like
Oh,
trying to get
right.
brownie points. They were just doing themselves and trying to say like, this is my life, this is where I am, and
Mhm.
what can I do with it? And that's really a powerful thing to say that people chose a
Mhm.
transformative path. And so, just in keeping with this, what if you were going to design interventions for people serving long sentences, to your point, what would you imagine could occur in prison that maybe isn't right now?
I think that part of my work is also looking at what does the criminal legal system, what does the carceral system offer, where are the gaps? So that's part of it. But I think that for me, one of the big things is really focusing on, like if I take that finding around early coping is really focusing on some of those coping strategies. So that's emotion regulation, and that is interpersonal effectiveness, and that is, um, you know, education, psychoeducation, if you will, around trauma um, and we talk about big capital T trauma, but early on when I talked to folks who were just released, I would say, "What effect does trauma have on your life?" And they would be like, "It doesn't." Like it just is what it is. And yet, as we ask those questions about what they've experienced, it becomes clear really quickly that they have been contending with individual interpersonal trauma and structural trauma, systems trauma for a really long time. And so, how do we help people understand that who they are, the responses that they have, makes sense for the experiences that they have endured and encountered. And then what do we do to help build their coping and their capacity to do life in a way that will result in more positive outcomes.
Yeah, because the truth is, if you show me somebody who's in prison for a really violent, horrific offense, I can show you someone who experienced poverty and violence and neglect and abuse and all of the things, all of the failures of external people to help them, and young children who suffered and navigated alone. I mean, that's really a common narrative across so many of the folks who committed truly horrific crimes, um, but then ultimately, sort of find themselves on the other side. I want to shift gears a little bit because there's another study that you recently did that's really interesting. You trace how people navigate intimacy and love after they've been released from really long prison terms. Because the truth is, a lot of these folks have been in solitary confinement, as you said. A lot of these folks have been in sort of abusive places where there's no autonomy, there's no sort of really any individuality. And you describe a duality that comes up, right? People are deeply interested in connecting, but they also have been conditioned to be afraid, to mistrust. So I'm wondering, how did you find in your work that duality, that tension, appears in their everyday lives for people coming home from prison?
That was something that came out loud and clear in talking with folks is that regardless of, what that experience was, they, just like everyone else, have this deep need and desire to love and to be loved. And that process, when you return to your community from incarceration, and especially, I think for this group, returning from a long-term incarceration that started when they were kids, at a time when, developmentally, that's when you're starting to, learn about yourself and learn about relationships and understand how that goes and try a whole lot of things out and flame out on a whole lot of things in terms of
Right.
relationships. And so coming out after having, kind of fought to survive for so long and then finding kind of an equilibrium, it becomes really hard then to figure out who you are in relation to somebody else and to be willing to be vulnerable, to really develop that relationship that you can trust. And so, um, you know, there are phrases that kind of not haunt me. That's a little dramatic, but they kind of ring in my head as I think about this. And one person talked about how, like, in order to do this intimacy thing or in order to do this relationship thing, you have to be open and ready to do that. And they're not,
Hmm.
all the skills, the strategies that they had used in prison just don't translate well to intimate relationships on the outside. Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so they talk a lot about how frustrating it is, how confusing it is, how, they're so used to having, kind of these subtle assessments of people, which again serves them well in prison to know, is somebody, going to hurt me? Is this something, can I trust you? Can I do all of that? Are they a threat, essentially, is what
Hmm.
they're assessing those subtleties for. And that is not something you can do and also have this vulnerable, trusting relationship with a
Yeah.
partner. Um, and
And I mean,
so,
listen, it's hard
yeah.
for
Oh my
people who
gosh.
haven't been incarcerated to be
Well,
vulnerable and intimate
right,
and open, all the things. And then
right,
to your point, right? These are people
right,
who have learned over decades that
mm,
being open and vulnerable puts you in a really bad spot in prison.
right,
And so
right.
shedding that is really hard. And I know that you talk about how some of the people in your study are sort of developmentally out of sync. Can you
Mhm.
share that a little bit? What does that mean? Because it makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense, but I had never um,
for our listeners, I had the opportunity to hear Daphne speak at a conference recently, and I had never really thought about that developmental out of syncness. So could you
Mhm.
share that? Explain it to us a little bit?
Sure, sure. Well, I think there are two ways that we see this show up. There's kind of like a developmentally out of sync. You have somebody who went in when they were 16 or 17, they came out when they are 40, 50, 60, right? And so they are encountering their peers, their expectations about what somebody who is 40, 50, 60 should accomplish, what they should be involved in. Um, those types of things. And so kind of on its face, they're developmentally out of sync. But I think that the other piece that I kind of have learned, and one of the things that is really interesting to me as a clinician, I think in particular, is that they haven't, so somebody said they haven't lived, right? Like they went in when they were 16 or 17. They had life experience before, and some of them were, some of them went in and had and actually were parents when they went in. But for the most part, they haven't done all of the things that we would expect from somebody who is in adolescence and early adulthood. So, as it relates to relationships in particular, kind of the dating around and exploring who you are and what works and what doesn't work, and never mind any of the internet stuff at this point, right? Like
Right.
just like that whole who you are in a relationship piece of it, that is not something that they have done on, outside of prison walls. And inside prison, people talked about how they did try and explore some of that, but it was often in coercive or in ways that were not condoned, I suppose, right? So relationships with other people who are incarcerated, with correctional staff, there were lots of ways in which they experimented in the way that we would anticipate they were going to experiment relationally and sexually, but not in the ways that somebody would if they were not in prison, I guess, so the dating around and all of that stuff and having your heart broken and, any of that really wasn't there. How do you build a life with somebody? And so that I think is what we encountered quite a bit. And so that had all sorts of implications when they came home. So,
Yeah, of course, because I mean, how do you build sort of this emotional literacy or attachment,
mhm,
security, or whatever words you want to use for people who've lived and functioned basically in survival mode for
right,
20, 30, 40 years?
right, right.
It's a really big ask. And I think one of the things that is often overlooked when we talk about these Miller kids, right? That's the name of the Supreme Court case that you referenced earlier, is just sort of some of those granular things about individuals and how they function when they return. And maybe some of the deficits that they bring, well, strengths certainly, but some of the maybe emotional deficits that they bring coming out of the traumatic conditions of prison.
Right.
Um, so it's a really interesting question. So one of the things I think is so interesting is the way in which some of the folks you talked with think about themselves. And I know they will say you've talked with folks who've said my past is not who I am, or I don't believe that is my story. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how you see people trying to reconcile their identity after so many years in prison.
So in my study, we did this, I called it a life events interview. It kind of pulled from from different modalities, but essentially I asked questions along a timeline from birth to present and then also like future with folks. And while they were talking, we built out this timeline and wrote it all down. And when we were done with the conversation, kind of looked at it together and were able to say, is there anything missing? What do you think? And I was not expecting it to have as much of an impact on people as it did. Like I was thinking about it as, this is just a great way for us to be able to have this conversation and kind of do that co-creation thing together. But participants talked about how looking at it all at once, like they
Mm-hmm.
had laid out their life story with, with the courts, with the mitigation specialists, with all of these people, but this was the first time where they could see it on a page and could observe their transformation, how their past is so much a part of who they am, but is not who they are. And so then kind of from there, I think that is what was most striking, is that it wasn't, no one denied what was, as you kind of shared, but it was really like they they made that choice at some point in time to do something different, and they were working really hard to live into that vision that they had for themselves, the way that they had changed. And so I think that that is something, with their vision of themselves became so much bigger, different. The words that they used to describe themselves went from, monster or worthless to hopeful to inquisitive to curious to loving to excited. And really wanted the people that they came home to, the people that they meet, to be able to see them for who they are now and who they're becoming, rather than that past of who they were.
I'm wondering also, in talking about this notion, part of it has to involve self-forgiveness, right? This notion of I was a monster, I did a terrible thing or many terrible things,
Mhm.
but I'm no longer a person who would do that ever. Like I don't even know what happened. What did you find about the role of forgiveness? What did you learn about the role of forgiveness from the folks you spoke with, either whether it's self-forgiveness or just forgiveness in general, forgiveness of others?
Forgiveness is like trauma. They very rarely used that word.
Mm.
Um, and so it's such an interesting question to think about. Um, I think the word that they used more often was around accountability
Mm-hmm.
and taking accountability for their actions, with themselves and also with people that they've harmed. There was not an expectation of forgiveness per se. Um, that probably is a very disappointing response to your question, but as I'm reflecting on it, um, that was not really a theme that emerged so much, and that was not a term that people used in those interviews.
You mean, I was thinking specifically of self-forgiveness, but it
Mhm.
wasn't a theme that they were looking for either from the families or people who they harmed.
Oh, no. Mm-mm.
Interesting.
Mm-mm.
Interesting. Interesting. Um, You've been leading a national study on juvenile life without parole and the folks who have been released. And I'm wondering, as we sort of are talking through all of these granular individual things, what are you looking at the macro level? What are you learning and seeing about the group of people who have been released, these sort of Miller kids, if you will? What are you seeing? Um,
So I think macro level. So I'll back up. The the national study that we're looking at, there is a group of us from University of California, Los Angeles, Johns Hopkins, Temple University, and here who we all were doing research with with juvenile lifers, with these Miller kids, in different areas of the country. It was all very regional. And one of the limitations was trying to get a better picture of, kind of the national look. So our study is really trying to capture that. So first, identifying who these kids were. So there were a lot of different numbers. Nobody was really keeping track of exactly who. So we tried to kind of create a finer point, put a finer point on it. And so we've identified about 2,900 folks who were sentenced to juvenile life without parole prior to that Miller ruling in 2012. And then trying to figure out where they are in our system. So are they still incarcerated? Have they been, starting with, have they been resentenced? If they've been resentenced, what were they resentenced to? Are they incarcerated? Are they released? Are they dead? So I think that is the mortality of this group is something that we were interested in. And then also, we know that each state kind of interpreted or implemented those federal rulings a little bit differently. And so trying to get an understanding of the policy landscape and how states did that. And then the other piece is a national survey. So folks who are currently incarcerated from this juvenile lifer group, and then folks who have been released. And so that's where we are in the process right now, and trying to get a sense for how they're doing. What have their experiences been? What were some of those early childhood experiences? What were their sentencing and resentencing or parole review experiences like? How are they doing in terms of health and well-being and all of those pieces? And so those are data we are currently collecting. But I think there have been a couple of things as we are initially doing some of this analysis that is emerging. And one is around the role of those adverse childhood experiences and those early experiences. And this group of individuals seems to be experiencing in number 2 to 3 times what we expect to see in the general population. And that is not something that we have known. Like, we've known it's high, but we have not been able to put an actual number on it. And so that is something that has kind of been coming up.
You talk about adverse childhood experiences, which clinicians refer to as ACE. And most people who are not living in violence and trauma have none or have one. But what you found is sort of remarkable. Can you tell us what it means when someone has a particularly high ACE score?
Yeah. So those adverse childhood experiences, research shows us that the higher your ACE score, the more likely or more vulnerable you are to negative outcomes. So these can be originally it was around health outcomes, and but we also know that the outcomes are not so great for mental health, and also increases someone's vulnerability to be involved in the criminal legal system. So we know that a higher number increases the likelihood for those negative outcomes. So some of those adverse childhood experiences are things like parental divorce or separation, a parent or a household member who has a severe mental illness, a household member who served time in jail or prison, experiences of housing or food insecurity, having any sort of physical abuse, emotional abuse. So it ranges, community violence. And so most people can endorse one of those, maybe two. But as soon as you get more than 2 or 3, all of a sudden that really increases your likelihood for those negative outcomes.
I mean, that's a huge finding right there, right? The fact
Yes.
that all of these people who experienced trauma as children are the very people who, perhaps not surprisingly, go on to commit really horrific violence and
Mm-hmm.
then are punished severely. And so
Right.
there's this gap, right, between the system responding early, intervening early with supportive measures, and
Right.
how we respond punitively once devastation occurs.
Right. Right. And so I think that is one finding. We also are really interested, I think, in this idea of transformation and recognizing that in all of our qualitative studies, that's something that has come through. But trying to get a sense for what is that? What is happening for people in that process? And so we're early in analysis of that, but I think really starting to look at what is that age of transformation, if you will, and what kinds of things are going on for people in that time, and who are they receiving support from, how do they feel supported in that process, and then also looking at social supports and these health outcomes and mental health outcomes. And so people talked a lot about how the importance of social support, but social support is something that people experience wildly differently in prison, right? So at least in Michigan, folks who lived their lives up until they were incarcerated in Detroit, let's say, would end up in, 500 miles away, and their families couldn't visit them. There were a lot of policy restrictions around contact, phone contact, a lot of things. The system gets in the way in lots of ways in terms of that. And so how are people faring? And so that is another thing that we are looking at, and finding surprisingly high levels of social support, felt social support, and starting to maybe tease out what are the types of social supports that people are getting. How do we, think about ways to nurture opportunities for those positive supports? How do we maybe think about ways to reduce the barriers to some more of those positive supports?
So, I'm thinking as we sort of wrap up our conversation here, you are this clinician, you are a researcher, you are an academic. If you could wave a magic wand and create a trauma-informed vision of justice, what do you think that would look like? What would that feel like? Like, what would you imagine, um, having sort of spoken with all these people who did survive so many years in prison and come out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's your vision?
Oh, that gave me tingly fingers. I think my vision is, and this is big, is not to focus just on reentry, or not just to focus on what's happening while people are incarcerated, but to start really thinking about that system continuation. So what does it look like? And I know we have a lot of prevention programs, and there are lots of
Do
ways
we
that,
do we do we
I
really
know,
have
do
a
we?
lot of
No,
prevention
I mean, I
programs?
think we're
Really?
really, no, I don't think we have enough. But I think this is the part where it becomes really challenging, because I think that a lot of people are like, oh, well, we've got Head Start, and we've got maternal infant health programs. We've got all of these different types of programs. We have money going here and we have money going there, and trauma-informed treatments for, juvenile justice and for the criminal legal system. And we've got all of these things, and we're using the same language. And yet we have so many people who are continuing to I'm going to say, fall through those cracks. And so I would love to see a more comprehensive approach to recognizing, like, how do we build a system that can visualize somebody essentially from birth to death, and the possibility that they're going to, or the idea that they are going to encounter different systems, not just the criminal legal system, but different systems along the way. And how do we ensure that they have the skills, the tools, um, the safe adults, the people in place